Case 1. Luca Magnotta. A severed hand arrived at a political office in Ottawa. No note, no explanation, just flesh, bone, and a message. Within hours, a severed foot showed up at a school in Vancouver. The country froze, because whoever sent these packages wasn't trying to hide. They were performing. May 2012. The world was still getting used to the idea that a single click could change everything. But for one man, the horror didn't start with a mouse click. It started with a hunger so deep that fame, attention, and notoriety became the only things that mattered. His name was Luca Magnotta, but that wasn't always his name. He was born Eric Newman in a small town in Ontario. Quiet, forgettable, invisible. And for a man who craved the spotlight more than oxygen, invisibility was a death sentence. So he reinvented himself, over and over again. He became a model, or at least he said he was. He dabbled in adult films under different aliases. He auditioned for reality TV shows, hoping anyone would see him. But the gates of celebrity remained locked. The traditional paths to fame didn't want him. So he turned to the one place where anyone could be anything: the internet. The lawless, chaotic frontier of the early 2000s. He built a digital house of mirrors. He created fake social media accounts, dozens of them, and used them to spread rumors about himself. He fabricated a romance with Karla Homolka, one of Canada's most infamous killers, just to see his name in a headline. It worked. Tabloids picked it up. People started talking. But talking wasn't enough. He needed more. In 2010, the videos started appearing. Grainy, disturbing. A man torturing and killing kittens. The internet, a place often drowning in chaos, found a rare moment of unity. Amateur sleuths, people with day jobs and families, began tracking the man in the videos. They studied the backgrounds, the furniture, the reflections in windows. They warned authorities. They said this wasn't just animal cruelty. This was a pattern. This was a stepping stone. They used a term that would haunt the case for years. Stepping stone killer. Someone who starts with animals and escalates to humans. The warnings were ignored. Before we go further, where are you watching from right now? Drop your city or country in the comments. Let's see how far this story has traveled. On May 24, 2012, the escalation reached its zenith. Jun Lin was a 33-year-old engineering student from China, and he came to Montreal looking for a better life. He was hardworking, kind, and kept to himself. He had dreams of finishing his degree, maybe bringing his family over one day. He was the kind of person you'd pass on the street and never think twice about. Invisible in his own way. And that made him the perfect target for a man who wanted the world to see him. Jun Lin lived in the same building as Luca Magnotta. They weren't friends, barely acquaintances. But Magnotta had been watching, planning. When Jun Lin went missing, his friends knew something was wrong immediately. He wasn't the type to just disappear. But by the time anyone realized what had happened, the horror had already gone global. Packages began arriving. A severed hand to the Conservative Party headquarters in Ottawa, a severed foot to an elementary school in Vancouver, and the country was paralyzed. And then the video surfaced. It was titled "One Lunatic, One Ice Pick." It was 11 minutes long. It was filmed with the precision of someone who had studied cinematography. The lighting, the angles, the music, a haunting instrumental that felt like it belonged in a horror film. Because that's exactly what it was. A horror film. Except it was real. The video showed the murder of Jun Lin. It showed dismemberment. It showed acts so depraved that even hardened investigators couldn't watch it all the way through. But Magnotta didn't just upload it and disappear. He made sure it spread. He posted it to shock sites. He sent links to journalists. He wanted the world to watch. And the world did. Millions of views in a matter of days. He had finally achieved what he'd been chasing his entire life: infamy. And by the time Interpol issued a red notice, Magnotta was gone. He fled to Paris, then Berlin. He wasn't hiding, though. He was touring, living his best life, posting photos, visiting cafes, and on May 29, 2012, German police found him in an internet cafe in Berlin. He wasn't researching escape routes or looking for a place to hide. He was reading news articles about himself, scrolling through headlines, watching his own face on the screen. He had become the story. And in that moment, sitting in that cafe, he had everything he ever wanted. The trial began in 2014. The defense argued schizophrenia. They painted a picture of a man lost in a fog, unable to distinguish reality from delusion. They said he heard voices, that he believed he was being controlled. But the prosecution told a different story. And they argued that Magnotta's mind was perfectly clear. That every step, from the videos to the packages to the flight across the Atlantic, was calculated, premeditated, a performance designed for maximum impact. The jury deliberated for 8 days, and when they returned, the verdict was clear: guilty of first-degree murder. Luca Magnotta was sentenced to life in prison with no chance of parole for 25 years. He's currently held in a maximum security facility where he continues to receive fan mail from people around the world who are fascinated by his story. Because that's the other side of infamy. It doesn't just destroy, it attracts. Junlin's family flew to Canada for the trial. They sat through every day of testimony. They listened to the details of their son's final moments. And when it was over, they returned to China with his ashes. And his mother said she would never understand why her son had to die, so that a stranger could feel famous. Magnotta proved something terrifying about the digital age: that the pursuit of attention, when left unchecked, can lead to the darkest places imaginable. He didn't just kill a man, he turned murder into content. And in doing so, he left a scar on the internet that will never fully heal. If you're already hooked, do me a favor. Hit that like button. It helps more people find stories like this, and trust me, we're just getting started. Case 2. Roch, Thériault. Picture this. A rural highway in Ontario, 1989. A car slows down for a hitchhiker. But this isn't your typical roadside pickup. The woman standing there is missing an arm. Her clothes are soaked in blood. Her eyes are hollow, like she's seen something no human should ever witness. The driver stops, terrified, and asks what happened. The woman's answer is simple: I need to get away from Moses. To understand how she lost her arm, we have to go back to a man who called himself Moses. Roch Thériault wasn't born a monster. He was born in a strict Catholic home in rural Quebec, where fire and brimstone sermons were as common as Sunday dinner. He grew up obsessed with the Old Testament, the plagues, the prophecies, the wrath of God. And somewhere along the way, he started to believe he wasn't just reading about prophets. He was one. By the late 1970s, Thériault had developed a following, not a large one, but devoted. He was magnetic in a way that's hard to explain unless you've met someone like him. He had this ability to look you in the eye and make you believe that the world was ending, and that he, and only he, could save you. He preached that the apocalypse was coming, that society was corrupt, that the only way to survive was to abandon everything and follow him into the wilderness. He called his group the Ant Hill Kids. The name was deliberate. Ants work tirelessly for the colony. They don't question. They don't rebel. They serve. And that's exactly what Thériault wanted: mindless, tireless devotion. In 1977, he led his followers into the wilderness, first to a remote area in Quebec, then later to Ontario. To the outside world, they looked like just another back-to-the-land commune, hippies trying to live off the grid. But inside that compound, it was something else entirely. It was a laboratory of human suffering, and Thériault's control was absolute. He dictated when people could speak, what they could eat, when they could sleep. He assigned marriages. He fathered children with multiple women in the group, calling it God's will. And then the surgeries began. Thériault claimed he had divine medical knowledge, that God spoke to him and told him how to heal the sick. But he didn't have medical training. He had kitchen knives, pliers, and an unshakable belief in his own authority. He performed procedures on his followers without anesthesia, without sterilization, without any understanding of anatomy. He pulled teeth as punishment. He amputated limbs when he decided someone was infected, and his followers let him. Because when you're isolated, when you've been told over and over that the outside world is evil and that this man is your only salvation, you stop questioning. One of his most loyal followers was a woman named Gabrielle Lavallee. She had joined the group as a young woman searching for meaning. She stayed because she believed, even when Thériault pulled 8 of her teeth with pliers because she didn't sell enough baked goods at a local market. Even when he beat her. Even when he decided her arm was corrupted and took it off with a meat cleaver in a single brutal swing. But Gabrielle wasn't the only victim. In 1988, a woman named Solange Boilard complained of stomach pain. Thériault decided she needed surgery. He cut her open on a kitchen table. He removed part of her intestine. She died in agony. But Thériault wasn't done. He spent the next several days performing rituals to bring her back to life. He punched her in the stomach. He inserted a tube into her body and blew air into her, believing it would restart her heart. It didn't. He eventually buried her in the woods and told the group that her death was part of God's plan. You might be thinking, how did no one stop this sooner? That's the question that haunts everyone who studied this case. Because people knew, neighbors saw, authorities were called. But isolation is a weapon, and Thériault knew exactly how to wield it. He moved the group frequently. He kept them away from towns. He told them that if they ever spoke to outsiders, they would be damned. And for years it worked. But in 1989, Gabrielle Lavallee reached her breaking point. After losing her arm, after years of abuse, she made a decision. She waited until Thériault was distracted, and she ran. She hitchhiked to the nearest hospital where doctors saw her mutilated body and immediately called the police. Her testimony was the key that unlocked the entire case. When authorities raided the compound, they found malnourished children, terrified adults, and evidence of years of systematic torture. Thériault was arrested and charged with second-degree murder in the death of Solange Boilard, along with numerous counts of assault. In 1993, he was sentenced to life in prison. But even behind bars, his grip on his followers didn't fully break. Some of them continued to visit him. He was allowed conjugal visits, and he fathered more children while incarcerated. He wrote letters. He still called himself a prophet. His end came in 2011, not by the hand of the law, but by a fellow inmate. Thériault was stabbed to death in his cell with a makeshift weapon. He died in the same violence he had preached for decades. There was no funeral, no ceremony. Just a quiet burial and a long list of people trying to rebuild their lives after years in his shadow. Roch Thériault's story is a reminder that monsters don't always announce themselves. Sometimes they come disguised as saviors, and by the time you realize what they are, it's already too late. Case 3. Guy Turcotte, a cardiologist's job is to keep hearts beating. But on February 20th, 2009, Guy Turcotte stopped 2 of them. The 911 call came in just after dawn. A man's voice, calm and detached, told the operator he had done something terrible. When police arrived at the home in Piedmont, Quebec, a quiet, affluent suburb north of Montreal, they found a scene that would haunt them for the rest of their careers. 2 children still in their beds, 5-year-old Olivier, 3-year-old Anne-Sophie, both had been stabbed repeatedly. Olivier 27 times, Anne-Sophie 19 times. Their father, Dr. Guy Turcotte, was found in his car nearby, barely conscious after drinking windshield washer fluid in what he claimed was a suicide attempt. To the outside world, Guy Turcotte and Isabelle Gaston were the definition of success. A power couple in Quebec's medical community. He was a respected cardiologist. She was a pharmaceutical representative. They had 2 beautiful children, a large home, and the kind of life people post about on social media. But behind closed doors, the marriage was a war zone. The cracks started to show in 2008. Isabelle had begun an affair with their personal trainer, a man who was also Guy's friend. When Turcotte found out, the betrayal didn't just hurt him, it consumed him. He became obsessed. He tracked her movements. He read her emails. He confronted her repeatedly, demanding answers, demanding she end it. But Isabelle had already made her decision. She wanted a divorce. What followed was a brutal custody battle, not the kind that plays out in courtrooms, but the kind that plays out in text messages and late-night arguments. Turcotte believed Isabelle was trying to take his children away from him. He believed she was poisoning them against him. And in his mind, she was doing it to be with another man, a man who had once been his friend. On February 20th, 2009, Turcotte was supposed to have the children for the weekend. Isabelle dropped them off at the house they used to share. She kissed them goodbye. She had no idea it would be the last time. That night, after the children were asleep, Turcotte sat alone in the house. He later claimed he drank windshield washer fluid, intending to kill himself. He said he didn't want his children to wake up and find their father dead. He said that's why he went into their rooms, to spare them the trauma. But the evidence told a different story. Olivier was stabbed 27 times, Anne-Sophie 19 times. These weren't mercy killings, these were acts of rage. And when investigators searched the house, they found something chilling. Turcotte had researched custody laws in the days leading up to the murders. He had sent Isabelle a text message that read, "You have no idea what's coming." The first trial began in 2011. Turcotte's defense team argued that he was suffering from an adjustment disorder, a mental break triggered by the stress of the divorce and the affair. They claimed he was in a psychotic state when he killed his children, unable to understand the nature of his actions. The prosecution argued the opposite. They said this was a calculated act of revenge. A man who couldn't have his family decided no one would. Quick question. What time is it where you are right now? Early morning, late night? Let me know in the comments. In June 2011, the jury delivered a verdict that shocked the nation. Not criminally responsible due to mental disorder. Turcotte would not go to prison. He would go to a psychiatric facility with the possibility of eventual release. The public reaction was immediate and furious. Protests erupted. Petitions circulated. How could a man who stabbed his children 46 times be considered not responsible? Isabelle Gaston, the children's mother, was devastated. She had sat through every day of the trial, listening to the details of how her children died. And now she was being told that the man who killed them wasn't a criminal. He was sick. The case went to appeal. In 2013, the Quebec Court of Appeal overturned the verdict, citing errors in the jury instructions. A second trial was ordered. This time, the prosecution came prepared. They focused on the text messages, the research into custody laws, the war Turcotte had promised his ex-wife. They argued that this wasn't a man who lost his mind. This was a man who made a choice. In 2015, the second jury found Guy Turcotte guilty of second-degree murder, and he was sentenced to life in prison with no chance of parole for 17 years. The courtroom erupted in applause. For many, it felt like justice had finally been served. But for Isabelle Gaston, no verdict could bring back her children. During her victim impact statement, she spoke directly to Turcotte. She told him about the birthdays that would never be celebrated, the graduations that would never happen, the grandchildren she would never meet. She said, "You didn't just kill our children. You killed every chapter of their lives that was supposed to be written." Turcotte remains in prison today. He's eligible to apply for parole in 2026, though it's unclear if he ever will. His case became a flashpoint in the debate over mental health and criminal responsibility, and it forced the legal system to reckon with a difficult question. When does illness end and accountability begin? Guy Turcotte was a man trained to save lives. He understood the human heart better than most. But on February 20th, 2009, he proved that knowledge and compassion are not the same thing, and that the most dangerous place in the world can be a quiet home on a winter night. If you haven't subscribed yet, now's the time. We're covering cases you won't hear anywhere else. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss what's coming next. Case 4. Maurice Boucher. August 9th, 1995. An 11-year-old boy named Daniel Roch was playing near his home in Montreal when a Jeep parked on the street exploded. The car bomb was meant for a rival gang member, but the shrapnel didn't care about targets. And it tore through Daniel's body, and 4 days later he died in the hospital. The city wept, vigils were held, and for the first time the public realized something terrifying. Montreal wasn't just a city anymore. It was a battlefield. And the general was a man they called Mom. Maurice Boucher didn't look like a general. He was short, stocky, with a thick mustache and a leather vest that never seemed to leave his back. But in the criminal underworld of 1990s Quebec, he was royalty. As the leader of the Hells Angels Nomads chapter, Boucher oversaw a narcotics empire that stretched across the province. He didn't just run a gang, he ran a corporation. And like any good CEO, he understood that to dominate the market, you had to eliminate the competition. The Quebec Biker War started in 1994 and didn't end until 2002. It was a brutal, bloody conflict between the Hells Angels and a rival alliance called the Roch Machine. Over 160 people died. Bombings became routine. Shootings happened in broad daylight. Innocent bystanders were caught in the crossfire. And at the center of it all was Boucher, orchestrating the violence with the cold precision of a military strategist. But Boucher wasn't content with just winning the drug trade. He wanted something more. He wanted to send a message that no one, not the police, not the courts, not the government, could touch him. So he made a decision that would change the course of Canadian criminal history. He decided to attack the justice system itself. In 1997, Boucher ordered the assassinations of prison guards. Not because they had wronged him personally, not because they were involved in the drug trade, but because they were symbols. They represented the state. And if he could make the state afraid, he could operate with impunity. On June 26, 1997, Diane Levine, a prison guard, was driving home from work when a van pulled up beside her. 2 men opened fire, killing her instantly. 3 months later, Pierre Rondeau, another prison guard, was ambushed and shot to death in the same way. The message was clear. If you work for the system, you're a target. The murders sent shockwaves through the province. Prison guards went on strike, refusing to work until they were given better protection. The government was forced to respond. But catching Boucher was another matter entirely. He was careful. He never pulled the trigger himself. He gave orders and others carried them out. And when the first trial for the murders of Levine and Rondeau began in 1998, the prosecution's case fell apart. The jury acquitted him. Many believed the acquittal wasn't about evidence. It was about fear. Jury intimidation was suspected, though never proven. Boucher walked out of the courtroom a free man, smiling for the cameras. He had beaten the system, or so he thought. Boucher didn't just break the law. He tried to break the system, and in doing so, he forced Canada to rewrite the rules. The authorities didn't give up. They knew Boucher was guilty. They just needed a way to prove it. The breakthrough came in 2000 when a high-ranking member of the Hells Angels named Stéphane Goddess Gagné agreed to cooperate. Gagné had been one of the shooters in the prison guard murders, and he was willing to testify against Boucher in exchange for a reduced sentence. The second trial began in 2002. This time, the prosecution had an insider. Gagné took the stand and described in detail how Boucher had ordered the hits. He explained the strategy. Kill the guards to destabilize the system, make the government afraid, show everyone that the Hells Angels were untouchable. The jury deliberated for 5 days. On May 5, 2002, they returned with a verdict: guilty of first-degree murder on both counts. Boucher was sentenced to life in prison with no chance of parole for 25 years. The courtroom erupted. For the first time in years, it felt like the justice system had won. Boucher was sent to a supermax facility where he spent the rest of his life in near-total isolation. He was kept away from other inmates. He allowed only minimal contact with the outside world. The man who once commanded an army was reduced to a prisoner in a concrete box. In 2022, Maurice Boucher died of throat cancer at the age of 69. There was no biker funeral, no procession of leather-clad mourners. He died alone, a pariah even within his own organization. The Hells Angels had moved on. The war was over, and Boucher had become a relic of a violent era that Quebec was desperate to forget. But his legacy remains. The murders of Diane Lavigne and Pierre Rondeau led to the creation of the biker laws, strict anti-gang legislation that gave police unprecedented powers to crack down on organized crime. The laws allowed for mass arrests, the seizure of assets, and harsher sentences for gang-related offenses. In 2009, Operation Charcuterie resulted in the arrest of over 150 Hells Angels members in a single day. The organization never fully recovered. Maurice "Mom" Boucher tried to prove that he was bigger than the law. In the end, he proved the opposite. He showed that when you push a system hard enough, it pushes back, and sometimes it pushes back harder than you ever imagined. Case 5. Allan Legere, May 3, 1989. Allan Legere was being transported from prison to a hospital in Moncton, New Brunswick, for treatment of an ear infection. It was supposed to be routine. A quick visit, then back to his cell. But somewhere between the hospital and the transport vehicle, Legere slipped away. He vanished into the dense, unforgiving woods of the Miramichi region, woods he knew better than anyone. And for 201 days, an entire region held its breath, and because somewhere in those woods, a killer was hunting. Legere wasn't just any prisoner. He was already a convicted killer serving a life sentence for the brutal 1986 murder of John Glendenning, a store owner who Legere had beaten to death during a robbery. Glendenning's common-law wife and her sister were also severely beaten in the attack. Legere was a violent, sadistic man, and everyone knew it. But no one expected what would happen once he was free. Within weeks of his escape, the killings began. And they weren't random. Legere had a type. He targeted the elderly and the vulnerable, people who lived alone, people who couldn't fight back. He moved through the night like a ghost, studying his victims, learning their routines. And then, when the moment was right, he struck. On May 29, 1989, his sisters Annie and Nina Flam were found dead in their home in Chatham Head. They were 75 and 61 years old. Both had been beaten and sexually assaulted. The house had been set on fire in an attempt to destroy evidence. The community was horrified, but it was just the beginning. In October, Legere broke into the home of Donna and Linda Dawney, a mother and daughter who lived in a quiet neighborhood. Donna was 45, Linda was 22. Both were beaten, sexually assaulted, and murdered. Again, the house was set on fire. The pattern was unmistakable. This wasn't a man killing out of desperation or panic. This was a predator who enjoyed what he was doing. On November 16th, Father James Smith, a 69-year-old Catholic priest, was found beaten to death in his rectory in Chatham Head. The beloved community figure had been bludgeoned with a blunt object, and his death sent shockwaves through the region. If a priest wasn't safe, no one was. The Miramichi region descended into a state of medieval terror. People stopped going out after dark. Halloween was canceled. Families slept with shotguns across their laps. Neighbors formed watch groups patrolling the streets with flashlights and baseball bats. And still, Legere remained at large. One of the most chilling details of his method was how he used darkness as a weapon. Before entering a home, he would unscrew the light bulbs on porches and walkways, plunging the area into shadow. Victims would step outside to investigate a noise and find themselves in total darkness, with Legere waiting. It was psychological warfare, and it worked. The manhunt was the largest in New Brunswick's history. Hundreds of officers combed the woods. Roadblocks were set up. Helicopters circled overhead. But Legere was always one step ahead. He knew the terrain. He knew where to hide, and he knew how to move without being seen. The break came on November 24th, 1989. A police officer spotted a man matching Legere's description near a convenience store in Rogersville, about 40 kilometers from Chatham. When the officer approached, Legere tried to run, but this time, there was nowhere to go. After 201 days on the run, the monster of the Miramichi was finally in custody. The trial that followed was a landmark moment in Canadian legal history. For the first time, DNA evidence played a central role in securing a conviction. Genetic material found at the crime scenes was matched to Legere with a level of certainty that had never been possible before. The science was new, but the results were undeniable. Legere's DNA was at every scene. There was no room for doubt. In 1991, Allan Legere was convicted of 4 counts of first-degree murder. The judge didn't just sentence him to life in prison, he designated him a dangerous offender, a legal status reserved for the most violent and irredeemable criminals. It meant Legere would never be released, ever. But even behind bars, Legere remained a threat. Over the years, he's been caught hiding makeshift weapons in his cell. He's assaulted guards. He's shown no remorse, no sign of rehabilitation. Now in his 70s, he's still considered a maximum security risk. The system has learned that some people can never be trusted no matter how much time passes. The impact of Allan Legere's crimes extended far beyond New Brunswick. His case influenced how Canada handles violent offenders, how DNA evidence is used in court, and how communities respond to threats. The Miramichi region has never fully recovered. The names of his victims, Annie and Nina Flom, Donna and Linda Dawney, Father James Smith, are etched into the collective memory of a community that lived through 7 months of unimaginable fear. Allan Legere is the embodiment of the stranger danger that haunts our collective psyche. He's the predator in the woods, the shadow at the window, the nightmare that doesn't end when you wake up. And even now, decades later, the people of the Miramichi still remember the 201 days when a monster walked among them. Case 6, Marc-André Grenon. For 22 years, Guylaine Potvin's killer walked free. Then a movie theater straw changed everything. April 28, 2000. Guylaine Potvin was a 19-year-old student living in Jonquière, Quebec. She was studying to become a nurse. She had her whole life ahead of her, plans, dreams, a future that seemed bright and full of possibility. But on that spring night, someone broke into her apartment. She fought back hard. Investigators found evidence of a violent struggle, but when they arrived, Guylaine was dead, and the person who killed her was gone. The case went cold almost immediately. There were no witnesses, no clear suspects, just a few pieces of forensic evidence that, at the time, couldn't lead anywhere. DNA technology in 2000 was still in its early stages, and the genetic material found under Guylaine's fingernails, evidence that she had clawed at her attacker, was preserved, but there was no match in any database. The file was placed in a drawer, and Guylaine's family was left with nothing but questions and grief. For 2 decades, they lived in a state of suspended anguish. Birthdays came and went. Anniversaries passed. And every year they wondered, is he still out there? Is he living a normal life while we're stuck in this nightmare? The answer was yes, he was. In 2022, investigators in Quebec decided to take another look at the case. But this time they had a tool that didn't exist in 2000, forensic genealogy. It's the same technology that caught the Golden State Killer in California, a method that uses DNA to trace family lineages and narrow down potential suspects. It's not magic. It's science, and it's changing the game. The DNA found under Guylaine's fingernails was male. Using Y chromosome analysis, investigators were able to trace the genetic signature back through paternal lines. They uploaded the profile to genealogy databases and started building a family tree. Slowly, methodically, they narrowed it down. And eventually, they arrived at a surname, Grenon. From there, the investigation became a manhunt. Detectives compiled a list of men with the last name Grenon, who were living in the Jonquière area in 2000. One name stood out, Marc-André Grenon. He had been a person of interest early in the investigation, but there hadn't been enough evidence to charge him. Now, 22 years later, he was back on their radar, but they needed a fresh DNA sample to confirm the match. And they needed to get it without tipping him off. So they went undercover. Real quick, what's the weather like where you are? Sunny? Raining? Snowing? Drop it in the comments. I'm curious. In a scene that sounds like it's straight out of a spy movie, officers followed Grenon to a movie theater. They waited, watched, and when he finished his drink and tossed the straw in the trash, they moved in. The straw was retrieved, bagged, and sent to the lab. The results came back a few days later. The DNA on that straw was a match to the DNA found under Guylaine Potvin's fingernails 22 years earlier. It wasn't just similar. It was identical. Marc-André Grenon was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. The trial began in 2024. The defense argued that the DNA evidence, while compelling, didn't prove Grenon was the killer, and they suggested contamination, coincidence, anything to create doubt. But the prosecution had more than just DNA. They had the timeline. They had Grenon's connection to the area, and they had something else, another victim. During the investigation, detectives discovered that Grenon's DNA also matched evidence from a brutal sexual assault that occurred in the same area in 2000, just months before Guylaine's murder. The victim in that case had survived, but she had lived in fear for over 2 decades, never knowing if her attacker would come back. Now, finally, she had answers. The jury deliberated for less than a day. On a cold morning in February 2024, they returned with a verdict, guilty of first-degree murder. Marc-André Grenon was sentenced to life in prison with no chance of parole for 25 years, and he showed no emotion as the verdict was read. But in the gallery, Guylaine's family wept, not tears of joy, but tears of relief. After 22 years, they finally had justice. Ghislaine Potvin's case represents the new frontier of true crime. It tells us that the past is never truly gone, that evidence doesn't expire, and that science is finally catching up to the monsters who thought they had escaped into the fog of time. For decades, killers like Grenon believed that if they could just stay quiet, stay hidden, they would get away with it. But forensic genealogy has changed the rules. Cold cases aren't cold anymore, they're just waiting. Marc-André Grenon lived a normal life for 22 years. He had a job, a routine, maybe even friends who had no idea what he had done. But every time he threw away a coffee cup, every time he left a fingerprint, and every time he existed in the world, he was leaving a trail. And eventually that trail led back to a 19-year-old nursing student who fought for her life and left just enough evidence to bring her killer to justice, even from beyond the grave. Case 7. Jacques Delisle. He was a judge. His job was to find the truth. But in 2009, he became the subject of a mystery that would take 15 years to solve. Jacques Delisle wasn't just any judge. He sat on the Quebec Court of Appeal, one of the highest courts in the province. For decades, he was the arbiter of justice, the man who decided guilt or innocence, who interpreted the law, who held the power to change lives with a single ruling. He was respected, admired, trusted. But on November 12, 2009, everything changed. That morning, Delisle called 911. His voice was calm, almost detached, and he told the operator that his wife, Nicole Rainville, was dead. When paramedics arrived at their luxury condo overlooking the St. Lawrence River in Quebec City, they found Nicole slumped in a chair on the balcony. There was a gunshot wound to her head. A .22 caliber revolver lay nearby. Delisle's explanation was simple. She had taken her own life. Nicole had suffered a stroke 2 years earlier. She was partially paralyzed, struggling with depression, and according to Delisle, she had talked about ending her life. He painted a picture of a woman in despair, a woman who saw no way out. And at first, the story seemed to hold. Suicide wasn't uncommon among stroke survivors. The physical and emotional toll could be unbearable. But then investigators started looking closer. The ballistics didn't fit, and the angle of the gunshot wound suggested the gun had been fired from a position Nicole couldn't have physically achieved on her own, given her limited mobility. The gunpowder residue on her hands was inconsistent with someone who had pulled the trigger themselves. And there were other details, small, nagging inconsistencies that didn't add up. The more investigators dug, the more the suicide story began to unravel. In 2012, Jacques Delisle was charged with first-degree murder. He became the first judge in Canadian history to face such a charge. The trial was a media sensation. A man who had spent his entire career upholding the law was now standing accused of breaking it in the most fundamental way. The prosecution argued that Delisle had killed his wife because he wanted to be with another woman, his secretary, even with whom he had been having an affair for years. They claimed he staged the scene to look like a suicide, using his knowledge of the legal system to try to get away with murder. The defense maintained that Nicole had taken her own life and that the forensic evidence was being misinterpreted. The jury sided with the prosecution. In June 2012, Jacques Delisle was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison with no chance of parole for 25 years. He was 77 years old. For many, it felt like a fall from grace. A man who had once represented justice was now a convicted killer. But the case didn't end there. Delisle's legal team immediately filed appeals, arguing that the forensic testimony used to convict him was flawed. And they brought in new ballistics experts who reviewed the evidence and came to a different conclusion, that suicide was, in fact, possible. The angle of the shot, the residue patterns, everything the prosecution had used to build their case, could be interpreted differently. For years, the case wound its way through the appeals process. In 2021, after a ministerial review uncovered serious concerns about the reliability of the original forensic testimony, a new trial was ordered. But by this point, Delisle was in his late 80s. His health was failing. The prospect of another lengthy trial seemed almost cruel. In 2024, a deal was struck. Delisle pleaded guilty to manslaughter, admitting that he had provided the weapon but denying that he had pulled the trigger. The plea allowed him to avoid another trial and be sentenced to time served. He was released from prison after spending over a decade behind bars. But his freedom was short-lived. Just months later, Jacques Delisle died. The case left more questions than answers. Did he kill his wife, or did she take her own life? Was the forensic evidence reliable, or was it flawed from the start? And if a judge, someone trained to evaluate evidence, to weigh facts, to seek the truth, could be convicted based on questionable science, what does that say about the justice system as a whole? The Delisle case is a haunting reminder of the fallibility of the legal system. It shows us that forensic science, while powerful, is not infallible. That expert testimony can be wrong, that convictions can be based on interpretations that later turn out to be flawed. And it forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. When the evidence is a matter of degrees and angles, when it comes down to one expert's word against another's, can we ever truly be sure? Jacques Delisle spent his entire career in pursuit of justice. But in the end, his own case became a symbol of how elusive justice can be. Was he a murderer who manipulated the system, or a grieving husband wrongly convicted? The answer depends on who you ask, and that ambiguity is perhaps the most unsettling part of all. We're almost at the end, but the next 3 cases might be the most disturbing yet. If you're still with me, leave a comment. Just say, "Still here." Let's see how many of you make it to the end. Case 8. Eustachio Gallese. In 2020, a 22-year-old woman was killed by a man the system knew was dangerous. Her death was preventable. And here's how it happened. Marilyn Lévesque was trying to make a living. At 22, she was working as a sex worker in Quebec City, doing what she could to get by in a world that didn't offer her many options. She met clients through ads, screened them as best she could, and tried to stay safe. But on January 22, 2020, she met a man named Eustachio Gallese in a hotel room in Sainte-Foy. And she had no idea that the system had sent him to her. Eustachio Gallese was a killer. In 2004, he had murdered his partner, Chantal Deschênes, beating her to death with a hammer in a fit of rage. He was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. Psychologists assessed him as a high-risk violent offender with deep-seated issues around women, control, and jealousy. He was the kind of man who should never have been let out. But in 2019, the Parole Board of Canada made a decision that defies all logic. They granted him day parole. The conditions of his release were supposed to manage his risk. He was required to live in a halfway house. He had to report his movements. And here's where it gets truly disturbing. The parole board allowed him to visit sex workers to meet his sexual needs. The reasoning, according to the board's own documents, was that allowing him controlled access to intimate services would help him reintegrate into society and reduce his risk of reoffending. Let that sink in for a moment. A man who had killed a woman in a jealous rage was given permission to pay vulnerable women for sex as part of his rehabilitation plan. Marilyn Lévesque didn't know any of this. She didn't know that the man who contacted her was a convicted murderer. She didn't know that he was on parole. She didn't know that the Parole Board of Canada had essentially turned her into a management tool for a killer's urges. She was just trying to make money. And the system failed to protect her. Over the months that followed his release, Gallese became obsessed with Marilyn. He saw her multiple times. He started to believe they had a relationship beyond the transactional. And when he realized she was seeing other clients, jealousy consumed him. The same jealousy that had driven him to kill 16 years earlier. On January 22, 2020, Gallese met Marilyn at a hotel. An argument broke out, and in a horrifying echo of his first murder, he killed her. He beat her to death just as he had done to Chantal Deschênes. When police arrived, they found Marilyn's body and Gallese attempting to take his own life. And he survived. She didn't. The backlash was immediate and justified. How could the parole board have allowed this to happen? How could a man with a documented history of violence against women be given access to vulnerable women as part of his so-called rehabilitation? The public was outraged. Marilyn's family was devastated, and the sex worker community was terrified, realizing that the system had used one of their own as a guinea pig in a dangerous experiment. This isn't just a failure, it's a betrayal, and it forced an entire nation to ask, who is the system really protecting? An inquest was launched. The findings were damning. The parole board had ignored red flags. Psychologists had warned that Gallese's risk hadn't diminished. His obsession with control, his inability to manage jealousy, his history of violence, all of it was documented. And yet the board prioritized his reintegration over the safety of the women he was allowed to see. The case led to sweeping changes in how parole is managed in Quebec and across Canada. New guidelines were put in place to prevent high-risk offenders from being granted access to sex workers. The criteria for day parole were tightened, and there was a broader conversation about how the justice system treats both offenders and the people they might harm. But for Marilyn Levesque, those changes came too late. She was 22 years old. She had a family who loved her. She had a life that was cut short because the system decided that a killer's needs were more important than her safety. Eustachio Gallese pleaded guilty to second-degree murder in 2021, and he was sentenced to life in prison with no chance of parole for 21 years. But no sentence can undo what happened. No policy change can bring Marilyn back. Her death is a stark reminder that when the system fails, the cost is measured in human lives, and that sometimes the most dangerous thing isn't the criminal, it's the institution that sets him free. Case 9. Gerald Gallant. In 2006, a quiet man who looked like your grandfather walked into a police station and confessed to 28 murders. Gerald Gallant was 58 years old. He had a soft face, thinning gray hair, and the kind of gentle demeanor that made people smile when they passed him on the street. He loved cycling. He'd ride for hours through the countryside around Donnacona, a small town about 40 kilometers west of Quebec City. Neighbors knew him as polite, reserved, maybe a little boring. He worked as a butcher. He went to church. He had a wife. If you saw him at the grocery store, you wouldn't look twice. But between 1978 and 2003, Gerald Gallant was the most prolific contract killer in Canadian history. At least 28 people died by his hand. Maybe more. The exact number will never be known, because Gallant himself lost count. He didn't kill out of passion or rage. He killed because it was his job. He was a professional enforcer, a hired gun for organized crime during the bloody Quebec biker wars. When someone needed to disappear, they called Gallant, and Gallant delivered. His method was chillingly efficient. He would scout a location for days, sometimes weeks. He'd learn his target's routine, where they lived, where they worked, when they were most vulnerable. He'd plan the hit down to the minute, and then when the moment was right, he'd execute. A gunshot, a knife, whatever the job required, clean, quick, professional. And then he'd go for a bike ride. That was his ritual. After every kill, Gallant would get on his bicycle and ride for miles. He said it helped him stay calm, kept his heart healthy. He treated murder the way most people treat a 9-to-5 job. Clock in, do the work, clock out, go home, have dinner with the wife. Repeat. For over 2 decades, Gallant operated in the shadows. He was careful. He didn't brag. He didn't draw attention to himself. He was the kind of killer law enforcement fears the most. The one who blends in, who doesn't fit the profile, who can walk past you on the street and you'd never know what he's capable of. But in 2006, everything changed. Gallant was arrested as part of a massive crackdown on organized crime in Quebec. Police had been building cases against dozens of gang members, and Gallant's name kept coming up. When they brought him in for questioning, they expected him to lawyer up, stay silent, protect the organization. Instead, he did something no one saw coming. He confessed to everything. He sat down with investigators and walked them through 28 murders. He gave names, dates, locations. He described how he was hired, how much he was paid, and who gave the orders. He didn't show remorse, but he didn't show pride either. He spoke about the killings the way someone might describe their daily commute, matter of fact, detached, as if he were reading from a grocery list. His cooperation was a goldmine for law enforcement, and the information he provided helped dismantle several organized crime cells. Dozens of people were arrested. Cases that had been cold for years were suddenly solved. Families who had spent decades wondering what happened to their loved ones finally got answers. But those answers came with a cost, the realization that the man responsible had been living among them the entire time, unnoticed and undetected. Gallant was sentenced to life in prison. He's currently serving his time in a federal penitentiary where he's considered a model inmate. He follows the rules. He keeps to himself. He's polite to the guards. Because that's who Gerald Gallant is. He's not a raging psychopath. He's not a sadistic monster who revels in violence. He's something far more unsettling. He's ordinary. This is what makes the Gallant case so disturbing, and it's a textbook example of the banality of evil. The idea that the worst atrocities can be committed by people who seem completely normal. Gallant didn't have a traumatic childhood. He wasn't abused. He wasn't driven by voices in his head or delusions of grandeur. He killed because it was a job, and he was good at it. And when the workday was over, he went home and lived a quiet, unremarkable life. He proves that monsters don't always look like monsters. They don't always have wild eyes and sinister grins. Sometimes they look like your neighbor, your coworker, the guy who waves at you from his bike as he rides past your house. And that's the most terrifying thing of all. Gerald Gallant spent 25 years as a contract killer, and no one suspected a thing. He attended family gatherings. He celebrated holidays. He lived a double life so seamlessly that even the people closest to him had no idea. And when he finally confessed, he did so without drama, without theatrics. Just a quiet man admitting to 28 murders, as casually as if he were discussing the weather. The Butcher of Donnacona is a reminder that evil doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it just rides by on a bicycle. Case 10. Michel Turcotte. I just killed my wife, I'm waiting for you. That's what Michel Turcotte told the 911 operator on February 20th, 2017. His voice was calm, resigned. When police arrived at his home in Montreal, they found him sitting quietly in the living room. In the bedroom, his wife, Jocelyne Lizotte, lay dead. She had been smothered with a pillow. Turcotte didn't run. He didn't resist. He simply waited. Because our final case isn't about hate, and it's about love. And that might make it the most complicated of all. Michel and Jocelyne had been together for decades. Theirs was the kind of love story people write songs about, two people who found each other and built a life together. They traveled, they laughed, they grew old side by side, but in 2007 everything changed. Jocelyn was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. At first, it was small things, forgetting names, misplacing keys. But Alzheimer's is a thief, and it takes everything. Slowly, methodically, it stole Jocelyn piece by piece. Her memories, her personality, her ability to recognize the man she had loved for so many years. By 2017, she couldn't speak. She couldn't move. She was bedridden, trapped in a body that no longer responded, in a mind that no longer knew where it was. Michel became her full-time caregiver, and for 9 years he watched the woman he loved disappear. He fed her, he bathed her, he changed her. He did everything the healthcare system should have helped with but didn't. He applied for assistance, he begged for support. But the waiting lists were long, the resources were scarce, and the system had no answers for him. He was alone, exhausted, and drowning in a grief that had no end in sight. On February 20th, 2017, Michel Turcotte reached his breaking point. He later told investigators that he couldn't watch her suffer anymore, that he couldn't bear the thought of her living in that state for years to come. So he made a decision. He walked into her room, placed a pillow over her face and held it there until she stopped breathing. And then he called the police. The case ignited a firestorm of debate across Canada. Was Michel Turcotte a murderer? Or was he a desperate man pushed to the edge by a system that failed him? The trial became less about the facts of the case. Turcotte admitted what he had done, and more about the larger questions surrounding aging, dignity, and compassion. The defense argued that Turcotte was a loving husband who had been abandoned by a healthcare system that offered no help and a legal system that offered no options. They pointed to his exhaustion, his isolation, his years of caregiving without support. They argued that he wasn't a danger to society. He was a man who had made an impossible choice in an impossible situation. The prosecution acknowledged Turcotte's suffering but maintained that taking a life, no matter the circumstances, was still a crime. That compassion, however genuine, could not be a justification for murder, and that if society allowed people to kill their loved ones out of mercy, where would the line be drawn? The jury found Michel Turcotte guilty of manslaughter, but the judge, in handing down the sentence, acknowledged the unique and tragic circumstances of the case. Turcotte was given a lenient sentence, 2 years less a day to be served in the community. He would not go to prison. He would go home, to the house he had shared with Jocelyn, to the memories that would haunt him for the rest of his life. But the case left the scars that went far beyond the courtroom. Jocelyn's family was divided. Some believed Michel had done the only humane thing. Others believed he had robbed Jocelyn of whatever time she had left, no matter the quality of that time. And the nation was left grappling with a question that has no easy answer. Where does compassion end and crime begin? Michel Turcotte's case forced Canada to confront the realities of an aging population, a strained healthcare system, and the limits of the law. It highlighted the gap between what the law allows and what desperate people feel they must do. And it reminded us that not all killers are driven by malice. Some are driven by love that has nowhere else to go. This one's tough. I want to know, do you think Turcotte is a criminal or a victim of a broken system? No judgment here. Just honest thoughts in the comments. 10 cases, 10 different paths to the same dark destination. From the digital narcissism of Luca Magnotta to the desperate mercy of Michel Turcotte. From the cult of pain built by Roch Thériault to the cold professionalism of Gerald Gallant. From the fallen justice of Jacques Delisle to the system failure that killed Marilyn Levesque. What do these stories tell us about the country we live in? They tell us that crime isn't a monolith. It's a reflection of our fears, our failures, and our technology. It's a reminder that justice is a process, not a guarantee. And most of all, it's a testament to the victims. June Lin, Marilyn Levesque, Guylaine Potvin, Olivier and Anne-Sophie Turcotte, Annie and Nina Flamme, Donna and Linda Donny, Father James Smith and Jocelyn Lizotte, whose lives were cut short by the shadows that live among us. As we close these files, remember the North is vast and it is quiet, but in that silence there are stories that need to be told, so that we might one day find a way to keep the veneer from breaking. Because beneath the silence there are always echoes. If you made it this far, you're part of a community that doesn't look away. Subscribe if you haven't already. Share this video with someone who loves true crime. And check out the next video on screen because there are always more stories beneath the silence. Thanks for watching.